Right. Thank you all. I am Youngmi Kim at the University of Edinburgh, Asian Studies Department. I'm a senior lecturer and also director of Scottish Center for Korean Studies. Today is following our previous distinguished lecture series with the poet Chae Young-mi, and I'm very honored to welcome our distinguished guest speakers, Professor Stephan Haggard and Professor David Kang. It's very special to me and also our students and our colleagues to have both of the authors because, I mean, the two don't really need introduction, right? Very widely known academics. And we've been using your books and articles for our courses and for our debate. And so I'm very happy to introduce two academics here. But I think that the two don't need an introduction, but I think I should still briefly introduce. Professor Stephan Haggard is a Lawrence and Sally Krauss Professor of Korea Pacific Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where he serves as director of Korea Pacific Program. He has written widely on the political economy of East Asia, including Pathways from the Periphery. I think that's what I used to quote a lot for my MA dissertation, and the political economy of financial crisis. That's another one I used to cite a lot. And hard target, sanctions, inducements, and the case of North Korea and developmental states in 18, sorry. So Professor Hoggart is also the editor of the Journal of East Asian Studies. And Professor David Kang is Maria Crutcher Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California and the director of the USC Korean Studies Institute. His publications include American Grand Strategy and East Asian Security in the 21st Century and East Asia Before the West, 5 Centuries of Trade and Tribute. I don't know if I say to everybody from good afternoon, good morning to good evening. The floor is yours, Dave.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Kim, for having Steph and me to Edinburgh. I really wish we could be there in person. I've never been to Scotland, but I follow the Visit Scotland Twitter feed, and they always post these amazing photos. So at some point, I want to go. Anyway, Steph and I are here to talk about a book that we just edited. And Steph and I talked about it. And what we figured we'd do is I would start first and lay out a little bit of the background for the idea and talk about the first half of the book. And then Steph will talk about the second half of the book. And then we can just go from there and hopefully have a wide-ranging discussion with all of the participants. Because I see Professor James Lewis, whose stuff I have used a lot, obviously Rudiger, many of you. So hopefully this can be fairly interactive. What we did, and I'm going to share my screen very briefly with you. Well, actually, I'll do that in a minute. Steph and I are political scientists. For those of you who study political science or international relations, you may know that almost everything we use, all of these stylized facts and history and things we use are from Europe. So if you study international, if you take any international relations undergraduate course on Introduction to International Relations, they will start almost always. When I started 20 years ago teaching, I got a bunch of syllabi, and everybody starts with Thucydides, the Melian Dialogue, Westphalia, et cetera, Napoleon, World War I, World War II. All of our examples come from Europe. We argue extensively over the state formation, Charles Tilly, right? State, war made state, states made war. When I started teaching, and my father's Korean. When I was growing up, I heard a little bit about some boat, some turtle boat. They fought the Japanese. I had no idea, right? I didn't pay attention. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever did. I realized over the years that we had no idea about whether the rest of the world acted the same way that Europe did. We just sort of assume that it did. And in fact, what we do is we take for granted that the European experience is universal. Thomas Hobbes, war, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Again and again and again, we talk about the lessons of history, but those lessons of history are always European lessons of history. As we know from the ancient Greeks, blah, 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 the Melian dialogue. So I started to look into East Asian history. And that's, East Asia Before the West, that book. And the more I found, some is the same as Europe, but a lot is different. And as I was going around over the last 10 years or so, I'd go and I would give these talks, and I would say to, sort of insulting or, criticizing people, saying, at different universities, saying, you guys should use more than just European examples. And people would say to me, I'd like to, but I don't know anything. And so what Steph and I decided to do, I started it out and I brought Steph in, and I'll explain why in a minute, but it was like, I could write up another book, a sort of scholarly book about how I think it worked. But why don't we try and take 10 events from East Asian history that every IR scholar should know? I mean, that was the original title of the book. Everybody should know it. And so what we did is we started to get people together, and I could have tried to do it myself, but this is one of the few times that an edited book truly should be edited, meaning we got individual scholars who were world-class at their various issues to be able to write up a readable chapter about what happened, so that we could then see what kind of lessons we draw. And we got a couple great young IR scholars to talk about what they thought as sort of mainstream American political scientists, what lessons they thought, And what was amazing about this project, sort of half historians, half IR scholars, was how vibrant it was. And for example, the last chapter, the IR scholars are very open to, wow, there's some things we can see we could fit into our existing frameworks. A lot of other stuff we have to really think about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you just through so you have an idea of what this book is about. And I'm going to use one example, and then I'll throw it over to Steph. So I'm going to share the screen for a minute here. It is this one. So we have 3 parts to the book, and I'm going to talk about parts 1 and 2. The first part is trying to do in 3 chapters, or essentially 2 chapters, simply trying to describe the international system over the long duration, 2,000 years, and then the political economy, the economic interactions over, again, Richard von Glan is a historian at UCLA, fabulous sort of historian of Chinese economy. And he used the 16th century as an example, but we can sort of talk about the number of interactions there. And then part 2 is the East Asian system over time. Nadia Kanagawa, the First World War, which is essentially the Tang-China Shilla alliance that crushed Goguryeo. Japan was involved in there, et cetera, et cetera. The founding of the Chosun dynasty in 1392. Some fascinating questions about how Chosun dynasty was able to survive next to this massive Ming thing. The Ming invasion of Vietnam. The Great East Asian War, Hideyoshi's invasion of Japan. Japanese generals, Japan's invasion of Korea. The Qing unification. We tried to have an event, but what came out is a lot of these things are not discrete events, but actually processes. So one thing that was interesting about Pamela Crossley, is fabulous Qing historian, is she said, it's not like Ming China was there, the Qing invaded, there was a war and somebody won. It was a 80-year process of internal decay and slow, fascinating discussions about how these kingdoms rose and fell. And then we go on to contact between the East and the West. Now, there are so many other events we could have chosen, obviously. We would have loved to do more. So this is hardly a exhaustive or definitive list. It's not like these are the 6 most important things from East Asian history. We would have loved something about the Chinese relationship with Tibet. We could go on and on and on. And so we view this volume as the beginning of hopefully a much more intense dialogue between political scientists and historians and people who study mainstream politics to take East Asia more seriously, not as some area studies, but wow, this should be central. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes and talk about one thing that probably all of you know, but surprisingly, you know, again, this is our mainstream profession in political science doesn't know this at all. And that's the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592, right? This is one of the most consequential wars in world history. It's unbelievable how big this war was. And yet it is totally outside the greatest hits of wars that we study, or, you know, outside of the accepted framework of political science. And in fact, you know, Professor Lewis has done stuff on this, the aftermath of the war, right? It should be so much more studied. And I'm only going to say a couple things. Number one, the first thing is the reason we should pay attention to it is the scale of this war dwarfed the scale of any war in Europe at the time, in Renaissance Europe. It was inconceivable that in Europe you could get together 200,000, 300,000 troops and send them across water. But that was the scale of the Japanese invasion, right? 700 ships, 158,000 troops initially, with another 100,000 in reserve. Just the scale, the logistical scale of this. Because one of the things when I started to talk about this 10 years ago in IR groups is they'd say, no, the stopping power of water, they couldn't fight. I was like, yes, they could. They had the logistical organizational capacity to fight war on an unimaginable scale compared to Europe. So just looking at all of the implications for that, for what it means for how powerful these states were at the time, what they could do in terms of their domestic politics, their militaries, their organization, their diplomacy, right? Fascinating stuff that should be going on there about how the war started. You know, I've tried, Ji Young has tried, Ken Swope, we've all sort of looked. It's not really clear even now why Japan invaded Korea. And here's the thing, here's one of my pet peeves. It's always called Hideyoshi's invasion. No, it's a Japanese invasion, right? Don't blame it on one guy, right? Like nobody says it's Hitler's war, it's Germany's war, or whatever else, right? Like, so stop calling it Hideyoshi's invasion. It's the Japanese invasion of Korea. It's not like, well, we had nothing to do with it. It was just that guy. No, right? A country chose. He was the leader, the country invaded. So number one, unbelievably large scale. But more than that, it was the only war between Japan, Korea, and China in 600 years, for 300 years beforehand. And for 300 years after this war, these countries didn't fight. The amazing thing about, you guys are in Scotland, right? I mean, you know, like how many times did England and Scotland like cross the border? How many times did the Vikings come over, and, you know, the Normans and Joan of Arc and 100 years, right? Right. The minute a war ends, the minute you guys pick yourselves up off the ground, you start invading each other again. So for 300 years, from the Mongol invasions in 1281 till 1592, and then after 1592, it was like 1894, whatever, right? 600 years, these countries chose. It was a choice not to fight. They clearly had the capacity to do so. But why they would go 600 years with one war in the middle is a question that really needs to be taken seriously. There's something else going on. It is not an endless war of all against all. That is clearly not what is happening in this region. And for us to take that seriously as political scientists, as international relations scholars, in many ways, I think forces us to rethink our fundamental assumptions about the way international relations work or politics works. Something was going on there. And, you know, I give my, you don't even have to agree with my argument, but it ought to be as deeply debated. I'm going to make one more thing and then I'm going to toss it over to Steph, right? Like in our profession, this is very much a work that's aimed at political scientists, because in our profession, the number of articles that continue to be written debating the causes of World War I is just sort of baffling to me, right? Fine, great, good. But, you know, World War I, it's not the biggest war that was fought on Europe. It's not even the most recent war that was fought in Europe, right? There was a Second World War. The amount of time we spend arguing about that, there ought to be as much or more debate and discussion about what this war means, why it caused, what it means for our theories as it does World War I. And I am really gratified in a lot of ways. I think the field is moving towards much more acceptance of this than when I started. When I started, it was really sort of dismissive, like, you little area specialist, sure, whatever. It's taken much more seriously now. And the final thing I will say is, this is not history. We have historians writing these chapters and things, but our goal is in many ways a interdisciplinary goal, right? This is really, we are not here to say we have something necessarily new to say or primary documents on the Ming invasion of China or whatever else, right? We're taking some of the best historians we've got and good IR people, world-class IR people, right? And trying to speak general themes to a larger audience. So it was an incredibly fruitful dialogue between historians and IR people. And there were times we had 2 conferences. Steph was fabulous. I brought in Steph because I really wanted his knowledge. Steph knows so much about contemporary East Asia, doesn't know that much about historical East Asia. But boy, was he open to the fundamental idea of the project. And Steph brings an incredible sort of ability to frame things and to put things in a perspective. I mean, just anybody who's been in a conference with Steph knows everybody listens when he gives comments on a paper because it's so insightful. So he was perfect to collaborate with on this. And it was great. I mean, sometimes the historians and IR people got mad at each other. There were times that, like, it was very clear there were disciplinary boundaries, that all the historians were on one side saying, you can't do that. And all the IR people were saying, but you have to. It was great, right? But in general, it was really wonderful. So, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And why don't I send it over to Steph? And Steph, you just let me know if you want me to put
Sure.
your thing up.
Well, Dave, you've set me up in an unfortunate way because now I have to live up to a reputation which I honestly don't enjoy in this area. But let me fill in a little bit of the theory, talking for the next 15 or 20 minutes, because I think what Dave has hit is a primarily kind of rhetorical function of the book, almost a political function of the book, which is to speak to the international relations community by bringing in a collaboration that involves historians and political scientists. But let me just frame up some of the more central theoretical themes in the part of the book that Dave is talking about, because they resonate very much today, I think. So when Dave talks about the biases towards the Westphalian system, they arise theoretically in part because you don't have other systems to compare that system to. So in effect, you're drawing inferences from an N of precisely 1. And so one of the reasons theoretically why it's important to look at other systems, and the East Asian system isn't the only one, is because in some ways, just methodologically, it's the only way we can generate possible comparisons. Now, I know, and perhaps Professor Lewis will speak about the world history movement and this trend towards integration. But the title of Dave's book, I think, is appropriate, China before the West, because it did constitute for many centuries a system which could be treated, again, for theoretical purposes, as distinct and somewhat isolated, at least in some important respects, from what was happening in Europe. So it has this methodological value. And so since the Fairbank work on the tribute system, going all the way back to the 40s, where this work has evolved in this first section of the book over the last decade is just quite remarkable outpouring of scholarship, essentially trying to settle the empirical question first of whether the Sinitic order was or wasn't more peaceful. And I should say that Dave has been, has a particular position on that it was, and he's also been challenged in that regard. But then the question is why? And whether it was hegemony, whether it was reforming balances over time, or, and I think this is probably one of the main theoretical themes in the book, whether it was a normative order generated by protocols and even ritual and cultural diffusion that essentially serve the function of pacifying the Sinitic order. And just jumping to the conclusion of the book, one of the things that's interesting is that Andrew Coe and Scott Wofford are actually game theorists, believe it or not. And one of the things they take up in the conclusion is the way in which game theory itself has come to recognize the significance of norms, for example, as focal points in bargaining games, and the fact that IR theorists really need to take some of the normative and therefore constructivist arguments more seriously, even in the context of working out of a rationalist framework. You know, this is a tremendous debate right now. I think that's a live debate. Do we think of norms in rationalist terms? Do we think of them in some more fundamentally constitutive way as normative structures that need to be understood normatively from within the norms, right? And so that's a central issue of debate that we take up. But I want to talk about part 3 of the book, and Dave's going to put it up briefly, and then I'm going to make a couple theoretical points about that part of the book. And let me say honestly that sometimes you don't actually know what you've done until you've done it. And in rereading these pieces for today, I was struck by a couple of themes that I want to bring up that show how comparative systems can be used to generate new theoretical insights. So we call this section of the book, and it was actually influenced by the movie of the same name, believe it or not, Contact, East and West, because it raises the questions of how the sinocentered order ultimately breaks down and what replaces it. And again, you know, for historians, the historians on the call can be laughing at us because, you know, there are these cycles of enthusiasms in political science. But the very simple point is that this is a section of the book which revisits imperialism. And, you know, something that we studied in graduate school, I studied in graduate school, kind of fell off the radar and now is roaring back again. And I've noticed that people with as significant vitas as Atul Kohli has a new book on imperialism, and young scholars like Adam Getachew are coming at the decolonization experience in entirely fresh theoretical ways. And so there's this sort of interest again in the long-term consequences of imperialism and how we understand imperialism and colonialism. And so let me go through the chapters and then stop the screen sharing and pause on a few of them. So Tony Andrade is one of the leading historians of the Dutch East India Company. He's worked in the archives at both ends of the planet. And he talks about how the insertion, that when the Dutch came, they inserted into Japanese, but particularly Chinese trading routes in the 1620s through the establishment of an outpost on Taiwan. And we chose that piece in part, Dave chose that piece because it addresses a set of debates about the nature of the era of commerce, so to speak, but also how East Asia, and I'll say something about this, was much more central in this regard and much larger just in terms of the volume of trade than what was going out of the great commercial mini empires, you know, Venice and even Amsterdam. And so there's a question of recentering our conception of how the global economy functioned at this time. So that paper plays that function. I'll come back to that. But the others, of course, raise the issue more directly of the European intrusion by the time that they were capable, the European powers were capable of projecting force and the role that Japan subsequently played in the region. So the papers on the Opium War by Richard Horowitz and on Matthew Perry by Alex Duden address this distinctive way in which British and American commercial ambitions get married to the use of force. And this is a quite interesting contrast to the earlier period in Andrade's piece on the Zheng state, when these were pirates in some sense, but also a world in which the port polities, as they were called in the Glan piece, were capable of functioning like a string of Hong Kong and Singapore's throughout the region for centuries. And you know, I'll come back to how that raises very interesting questions. And then the contributions of Andrew Yo, So-Hyun Park, and Se-Yoon Park address American and Japanese imperialism at the end of the 19th century. But Andrew Yo's piece is quite interesting because he poses the question not in terms of the onset of the war between the United States and Spain, or between the United States and the Filipinos, but the Philippine national independence movement and its reliance on the transnational sharing of ideas from Spanish liberalism, interestingly, through the persons of the Ilustrados. And then finally, we talk about Japan getting into this game, and essentially how Japan becomes one of the imperial consortium, which of course goes back to the question of how China and Japan's responded quite differently to these external pressures. So that's the sort of arc of this book, the part of the book on contact. You can close that, Dave. So again, I want to provide just a couple of examples of how debates in political science and history can be fruitfully joined. And one of them comes out of this Andrade chapter that I've mentioned, but also Glon's chapter is just a masterful review of the international political economy of East Asia. It's about the 1600s, but it's what we might call the long 1600s, because it bleeds into the earlier Ming restrictions and then later into the reclosure, if you might want to call it that. But one of the points that they make that's quite interesting is that these trade networks functioned in part precisely because they were at the periphery of the interests of the main powers that made up this Sinitic order. It's exactly because they were peripheral that they were able to function, that they were at the periphery of the core tribute system. And they were at the periphery of a fiscal system that was more dependent on land rents than on maritime taxes. And the point is made quite interestingly that the consolidation, the state building under the Qing and the Tokugawa actually has the effect of closing these networks down. And that just immediately raises this question of how exactly were these networks sustained? And I'm sure Professor Lewis and others will bring to our attention work that I'm not familiar with, but it reminds me of this very fruitful theoretical work by Avner Greif on the Maghrebi traders, in which he joins this incredible historical work on the Levant trade with an understanding of how contracting was enforced through these diverse institutions that had been created by Jewish traders in the Maghreb. So those are the kind of touch points where we can start to theorize about how an international political economy can get constructed in a way which is very different from that which we talk about in the post-war period, where we think of it as an outgrowth in part of hegemony, but also of formal interstate international institutions. And that just clearly wasn't true during this era. And we have to understand that era on its own terms as a theoretically rich opportunity to think about the underlying sources of exchange. Now, the second issue that comes out of the contact period, and again, I actually want to apologize to Dave. I really wish I had done more on this in the introduction at the time, but I was really struck in rereading these pieces about the strange role that was played by law. The strange role that was played by law in this transitional period between a legally pluralist order of one sort under this Sinitic tribute system, where China was in many ways quite tolerant of other legal orders, and what constituted the legal framework had a certain looseness to it. And then what we consider the coming of the Westphalian system and the introduction of law, but introduction of law in a way which is completely distant from what we typically consider axiomatic features of the law, like equality under the law or the idea of impartiality. Because of course the law is imposed, it's a tool of domination through the extraterritorial agreements, which are not a transitional phase. You guys, you know this. I mean, as Xi Jinping says, 100 years of humiliation. This is the CCP. I mean, these are systems which are set in place in the wake of the Opium Wars, and they're subsequently supplanted by direct Japanese imperialism. But in some way, this transitional era lasts for over a century. And what was this, and what role did law really play? So Se-Young Park, has a really fantastic piece in this book, and I wanted to read a passage from it because it gets at a theme which Dave in particular I think comes back to repeatedly, which is this idea that norms, protocols, even rituals are quite fundamental in this order. But she writes in a way which is not my style of writing, but it's powerful nonetheless. So let me just read this passage if I could. She says, further, the Japanese gains were made in the arena of bureaucracy, ritual, and protocol, not only troubles narratives that conceive of causative intersections between military violence, nation building, and structural change. So she's setting these two, she's undertaking this binary in which we think of what happens in imperialism through the lens of power, and state formation and of structural change. She says it also highlights the real power gleaned from cultural disenfranchisement, or the politicization and creation of, quote, traditional and backward categories, forms of aggression and disenfranchisement, and empowered the gradual induction of this region into Westphalia. So, again, I think this is just such an opportunity of reflection. We think of Westphalia as a state system. It gradually, over a long period of time, evolves a conception of international law. The idea of rule of law becomes foundational to thinking about the liberal post-war order. Yet when we look at the way that law inducts East Asia into Westphalia, it's a legal system which is just rife with opportunism. I mean, it's sort of contrary to what we even think of as law. And again, these are the kind of comparative questions which it's hard to ask without looking across systems over the long durée. And I'll just close with one obvious point, because it leads into volume 2, which Dave and I are thinking about, is, Japan clearly, there's a narrative of East Asia in international relations theory in the 20th century that centers very much on the rise of Japan and goes from, the initial multilateral commitments under the Washington system to how those are broken in 1931-37 and then up through, Pearl Harbor. But there's this earlier period when Japan is effectively learning how to appropriate components of the legal order as distorted through the extraterritorial use of the law, and is adopting those tools in ways which help explain why these treaties, these unequal treaties, look the way they do. For example, how after the Sino-Japanese War, Japan was quite intent on establishing the independence of Korea, even though, of course, it had no interest in recognizing that, but as a way of structuring a sovereignty that permitted Japan to enter the ranks of the imperial powers. And these are the kind of debates which historians obviously have, but I think political scientists need to join when they start thinking about things like the rule of law or multilateralism. When we had a multilateral system in the late 19th century, but it was effectively imperial. Well, what does that tell us about the International Monetary Fund? To put it bluntly, right? I think there are insights to be joined there. Anyway, I'll stop and we can have a conversation.
Thank you. I think our webinar consists of very well balanced with social scientists, with historian. I saw Professor J. Lewis is here, right? And also we have our own historian, starting with Dr. Holly Stephens and Dr. Sang-Pil Jin. And I saw Dr. John Lee is here too. So feel free to ask your questions. I think Sang-Pil is the right person somewhere in the middle between historian and political scientist. Sang-Pil works on diplomatic history, and his recent research is on neutralization of Korea in 1900s. Sang-Pil, would you like to start your comments and questions?
Yes, thank you, Youngmi, and thank you very much, Professors Haggard and Kang, for your very enlightening talk. I don't know if I'm qualified to give comments or ask you any questions regarding that. I'm just early research career, to put it best, I guess, but I will do my best. Yeah. So I will start with my comments, and then I do have 3 questions. So I hope I could get some of your feedback on that. So having read through your book, I agree I agree with you that there is a deep bias in international relations and comparative politics on this notion that state is constantly under anarchy, which is European notion, as both of you have pointed out. And of course, that again, I think we can all agree that there has been rather too much on Eurocentric perspective on understanding international relations, even regions including not just East Asia, I might add, but such as Islamic region, which in my view, honestly, I don't have much knowledge on that, but having read recently about this book written by a French scholar on maritime history based on the Islamic region, I think it's safe to assume that Islamic region too had its own way of maintaining its own international state system. That's my take. I would take, and another thing that I think I really garnered from your book is this comparison between hegemonic versus multipolar international system and hierarchy on international relations and the cultural impact of ideas and material interests in terms of the international political outcomes. And I also think that although you both of you alluded that this is up to the like future research, but I liked how both of you seem to agree that past affects the present. So another reason why we need to look into past events in East Asia is to look into those case studies and then figure out how, at least I guess, the East Asian region may function in the future. And I guess another thing that I kind of agree with you in general, but with some exceptions, is that in the history of East Asia, not always, but chances are there was one dominant member, in this case, China. And there was, compared to say Europe, there was lack of multipolar city in the sense that there was no power as powerful as China that can challenge its order. And another thing that I found quite interesting is the way you have compared Dutch and the British and even American hegemony with that of Chinese hegemony in the region, in the sense that you argue that under Chinese hegemony, at least in East Asia, that is, that for centuries it has managed to exert quite profound influences in terms of culture, religion, politics, society, and economy. And you argue that compared to say British or American hegemony, China's influence in the region was much more profound. And another thing that I think I really appreciate is that you still did not miss that while it is true that countries like Korea or Vietnam that were more under Chinese influence, or we call them more Sinized, he also notes that this tributary order functions differently with Central Asian nomads because when it comes to say China, I guess Korea or Vietnam, Chinese dynasties by and large were okay as long as both kingdoms pay tributes and follow the rituals prescribed by the Middle Kingdom, then by and large they're okay with it. But Central Asian peoples, in contrast, uh, Chinese dynasties were much more willing to use force to force them, way to toe their line, which was not always successful. I'm sure that you are very aware of that. And this notion of this investor, and you say that Chinese dynasties use this system to not necessarily coerce because many of these East Asian kingdoms went along with it. Whilst accepting their titles from the Chinese emperors and these East Asian states monarchs were by and large were willing to go along with that. But I would also not question, but I guess slightly have my own view on this because I think it's true that in Joseon times, it's true that at least apart from the earlier times, especially the first king Isongge, if you look at Korea times, I think whilst it seemed like that Korea kings were also following will perfectly go along with tributary system, but I think in reality was much more different. I say this because, for example, if you look at research from Dutch scholar Renko Breiker, and because both of you mentioned the ritual, if you look at the way, for example, how Chinese envoys were received in the Goryeo court, and you compare with the Joseon court, it was very different. So let's say if the Chinese envoy comes to Korea during Goryeo times, for example, people like Su Jing, who wrote the record about his visit to Goryeo, right? He was received as a guest, not as somebody that this is a person who is representing a senior empire, and I'm here to impose my the song orders to Korea. It was not like that. So although in terms of document we say, let's say this is a document from the Song Emperor, and I'm giving it to Goryeo Yejong, Injong, in fact, during the Sujing time. But in reality, both Renko Breiker and Henry argued that Goryeo monarchs considered themselves kind of like an emperor even. And there's a much truth to it because if you compare, let's say, rituals adopted by Goryeo kings and Joseon kings, for example, Goryeo kings until the Mongol domination actually called themselves in effect emperor. Because in Korea, I'm sure you know, in Joseon times, Joseon kings addressed themselves as Gwain when they refer to me, which is title used for the king. Whereas Goryeo emperors, they call themselves Jim, which is imperial title. And again, speaking of rituals, Goryeo emperor kings performed their heavenly rituals that supposedly only Chinese emperors were allowed to do, but Goryeo kings, they did it. Whereas Joseon, apart from King Sejo, and as far as I know, Gwangaegun briefly and Taeju and Taejong, they did not perform that rituals to the heaven, because they realized that, okay, we are just a king, not an emperor. But the reason why I'm bringing this out is that I think we have to understand how even under the tributary system, there are times when we can adopt a pluralistic understanding of the order. So yes, China is number one, but there's a difference when there's a one hegemony power, meaning controlling not controlling, but having the top dog in the region. But as you know, during medieval times, Chinese mainland, for example, was divided by Liao and Song, and that allowed Korea to play like a important role as an autonomous power. And you can say the same thing with briefly until Korea decided to adopt a Sade system to Jin. But until then, you had Jin, Korea, Song, at that time Southern Song, that existed as the same system. So I think we need to factor in this system. and say that it's much more than say, okay, there was one dominant power. And I do agree with you that it only lasted maybe 200, 300 years. So out of say 2000, it doesn't seem like a big deal. However, if you want to give justice to Toyotomi's invasion, which only lasted 6 years, and say this is a big event, could we not also give some dues for Korea's role that it adopted in the say about 200 years that allowed neither Song or Liao to underestimate Korea as a regional balancer. And moving on to my questions, because I guess I've spoken too long, I'm sorry. And my first question is, although I perfectly understand your justification for not including such case studies, I still think for the interest of the readers and of scholars that I really hoped that perhaps in the future, volume 2 or volume 3, you could include example of Korea between Liao and Song. Because it will show that, because you could argue that yes, by and large, China's hegemony was supreme, but there were instances where even mighty empires like Liao and Song could not underestimate Korea's role. So that's one question. Number 2 is you say that Westphalian system by and large prescribes equality, whereas tribute system it is not. But my counterpoint would be then, while it's true that in terms of rituals and the way they conduct diplomacy, it seems like Westphalian is perfectly equal, and tribute system is very hierarchical. But can we not also argue that if you compare with say East European states' relations with the Soviet Union under Westphalian, with the Soviet Union, and then you compare with the Ming and Joseon, apart from the Toyotomi's invasion period, and briefly afterwards, there were no Chinese troops stationed in Korea. And I'm sure you all know that although even the Chinese envoys, for example, they were literally, if ever, they rarely commented about Korea's domestic affairs or suggests specific measures to push them, you must adopt such a policy. Whereas I think we can all agree, like you see how the America tells supposedly its allies that, oh, you need to open your market, you need to revise this and law, you know, to buy our goods. I think that's, to me, suggests that this is also hierarchical, because I think very few of us would be delusioned to believe that, say, South Korea's president enjoys perfectly equal relationship with the president of the United States. So that's another question. And finally, the final question is, although you left it for the future research, how do you foresee the conflict between enduring legacies of the Sinocentric tributary system and Westphalian system in East Asia? Because as you can see from the South China Sea dispute, China constantly refers to those historical examples to buttress their position, whereas Western powers, even the Southeast Asian states, say, well, you know, the international court already made a decision, so you must follow this. So I see this as kind of like a conflict between China-centered world order and Westphalian system. So maybe you could also comment on that. Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry for talking too much.
I think you met hardcore historian here. If you remember the question, please go ahead.
Should I
go ahead, Dave? Yeah,
first?
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. First of all, fabulous comments. That's a model for all of you grad students for how to discuss a paper. That was great, right? Lots of stuff to talk about. I will say the reason I was sort of grinning is I literally sent Steph a paper that I'm working on about Songnyo Koryo Shide right yesterday, because it's so fascinating. So I'm not going to talk about it here too much, other than to say, I think in many ways you're absolutely right about Koryo. And yet, what to me is so fascinating is they still use the institutions of the tribute system. Checkbong, right? You know, like investiture, jogong, right? Giving, all the stuff is there. And the paper that I've been writing has been trying to take that and say, even under multipolarity, these norms and institutions are how they dealt with each other. And it really mattered. I mean, one of the amazing things, as you guys know about Koryo, is, and this is something that I really, I would be delighted to talk to any of you who know more than me about this era, right? Any of you who are interested in this paper, I will send it to you. Email me, I'll send it to you, right? Because the Mongols, right? We all just think they're a bunch of barbarian hordes, right? Korea, Koryo suffered enormous consequences because they thought they didn't deserve checkbone. They, you know, Korea held out. We're not gonna allow you to be number one. The minute they actually finally agreed to it, Mongols stopped invading them. But this is not a superficial thing. There were hundreds of thousands of Korean deaths because they thought that they weren't deserving of the mandate of heaven and everything else, right? Unpacking that is so fascinating, right? That there is so much more than simply if it was purely a military power situation, the Koreans would have given up right away. It was obvious the Mongols could crush them if they wanted to, but they didn't, right? That's what's so fascinating. So I'll just say that. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Steph, is the link between the past and the present, I think, is one of the most fascinating things that we have sort of put off, and even I sort of put off. I'll say one thing. I say this a lot. I get yelled at a lot for saying it, but two superpowers intervened on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. One of them pulled all their troops back by 1958. The other one still has, you know, clinging like grim death to bases and on the peninsula, right? Yet we think China's the one that's aggressive. And the Chinese are like, it's not our country, man, leave us alone, right? And we have historical precedent. Chinese could have stayed, as you pointed out, they could have stayed in 1598. Of course they could have stayed and just made it the 33rd Chinese province. But they went home. They're like, this is not our country. Good luck with that, Korea. So I think there's a lot of ways, if we take one step back and really begin to interrogate this, there's so many fascinating things that come up. So I don't want to take too much time as well, but I just think you've hit some great points, and I'll turn it over to Steph.
Yeah, I want to hear from more people too, so I'll just make two very short points. I mean, one, obviously, you know, history issues are alive, quite obviously, in the Sino-Japanese and the you know, relationship, and now in the downward spiral between Korea and Japan. But I think that Dave at least has raised the issue of whether history is not just manifest in that particular way of entrepreneurial use of history for political purposes, which in my view is what's going on, but also whether China itself may be able to draw on these earlier traditions in structuring its own contemporary world. And Dave and I worry about that in different ways. You know, I think Dave is somewhat more sanguine that you could have a new East Asian hierarchy, which is peaceful, and I'm more concerned about that as a liberal. But you know, if you look at the BRI looks more like a tribute system than it does a system of law. It's not a system of law. It's not a multilateral institution. It's a set of hub and spokes relationships, right? And the second point, and this is just solely for definitional purposes, Samjin, because your comments were just great. But just to explain, you know, within IR theory at the moment, there is a distinction between power and authority that's been played out, particularly by David Lake, who argues that, yes, you know, you have a hierarchical order, but a hierarchical order which is imposed by force, like a standard colonial arrangement, is different than one in which the subjected parties essentially buy into the authority of the US. You know, this idea of invited imperialism, for example, you know, with respect to Europe. Now, whether you buy that or not, but it is, you know, this is the terrain on which this is currently being fought, is it's different to impose an order than it is to lead and have people follow you, believing in a Weberian sense in the idea of someone exercising authority.
We have a question from Rudiger.
Yeah, actually, it's two comments, if I may. Well, first of all, a disclaimer. I will definitely buy the book. It looks fantastic. But I haven't read it. So what I can say so far is basically based on what I just heard or what I think I heard. So my apologies in advance if I perhaps wasn't getting your points 100%. My first point is thinking back to what Confucius said when he was asked what he would do when he would become ruler. He said many things. And one that I always remember, because I use it as an example to my students, that they first need to get their terminology right, is that he would rectify names. And then there is this funny story about what that means and how it leads to proper punishments and all the rest of it. I'm not talking about punishment here, but Dave, when you were talking about all those wars in Europe and this peaceful East Asia, I was thinking, what are you talking about? What qualifies as a war? You mentioned, all the stuff going on in Britain between Scotland and England, or I don't know, Wessex and Mercia, or however far you want to go back. I'm pretty sure you had lots of stuff like this in East Asia, but we would qualify that as local skirmishes, right? Think about Japan, all these military conflicts between the daimyos there. Sure, you wouldn't count them as wars, right? Because that is an internal affair. Or look at China or Korea, all those incursions or conflicts they had with outside forces. I'm not talking about the Mongolians in the 13th century. I mean, that was going on continuously, right? Right after Hideyoshi, the Japanese invasion, you had the Manchu, but you also had the Khitan, and you had the Jurchen, and you had the Japanese pirates, and you had Chinese pirates. If you count that as wars, the whole thing would look very different. So I guess one key point is if you work with this argument, you have to define what a war is. Of course, it sometimes works the other way. I just had to look it up to make sure I'm not talking bullshit on my own area of expertise, which is North Korea. If you look at the North Korean story about the Battle of Pocheonbo, it sounds like there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting each other, although we know it was less than 200 North Korean guerrillas, right? But that counts as a battle. So, the question is, how do you define war before you then start telling us there was this long period of peace opposed to continuous war in Europe? And I'm pretty sure you have an answer on that. Anyway, that was my first point. The other point is a bit more provocative, maybe. That's something that has been bothering me for a while. I do see a certain tendency to replace perhaps one particularism with the other. I should add that personally, I'm not even that much convinced by the argument that all those theories that emerged in the West are biased because they are based only on Western examples, because at the end of the day, we are talking about human societies, and it doesn't really matter where you take your examples from, as long as your level of abstraction is high enough, they will definitely apply elsewhere. But I also do know, of course, that especially China has been particularly active in the last 20 years to try to convince, in particular, East Asianists, that's how they usually start, by telling them, look, guys, you are so Western focused and you should really now look also for East Asian theories of, for example, international relations. And I know lots of stuff has been written about this. I was kind of thinking about what Japan did a couple of decades before. It's really quite political. Or, in the early 90s, we had a debate about the East Asian values, and you had Ishihara Shintaro of Japan and Mahathir Mohamad saying, oh, all this Western democracy stuff, this is just a Western thing. It's nothing for us in East Asia. So you also see the dangers of that, right? So I'm kind of concerned that we might be entering a certain trap, especially we Westerners, always having this kind of white man's burden on our shoulder and this feeling like, we've wronged them so many times. We need to show more humility and, let's just push forward with this idea that, we should really look at the world through East Asian eyes. I don't think so. I think we shouldn't look through either Western or East Asian eyes. We should try to find a level of abstraction where we understand that all our societies are human and that we might be doing different things out of certain particularities that are prevalent in a certain region. But perhaps, the higher you go, you will figure out that at the end of the day, it's all the same. I guess I stop here because I hope I provoked you into hopefully some very sharp and good answers. So thank you anyway. That's fantastic, and it's very inspiring. So I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I don't want us to get sidetracked on how many wars there were, only because I think that battle's been over, man. That war is done. It's widely established that rates of violence are different in historical Europe than they were, patterns and rates were than they were in historical East Asia. I don't think that's really a debate anymore. The real question is how and why they worked out that way, right? This, I don't deal with it in this book, right? But I've published like 4 or 5 different articles where we do exactly what you say. What's a war? How do you define a war when war existed before what we call a nation-state system of the 19th century, right? So what, for example, what I have done first in my book a long time ago, and then with some collaborators, we did Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese sources, 중국 역대 전쟁 연표, and you code them. What's a war? What's a skirmish? What's a pirate raid, et cetera, and you can see the patterns and the rates, right? And then you have to just explain it. So I won't put it there, and it's not just my work. There's a lot of work. Mark Dinkeko at Michigan, Yuhua Wang at Harvard. A lot of people have done this. So if you're interested in it, I'd be happy to point you in the direction of that stuff, right? That's where we go. I mean, obviously, just talking off the top of my head, people really dislike point number 2 that you said, which is Europe is here, Asia's different. Let's be Orientalists, right? That's not what we're doing. If we're going to ask the question, we have to ask it. And let me give you an example. In other words, if we're going to ask the question of, is everything from Europe simply universal? We have to ask that question and take it seriously. And that means taking seriously the history of other things. Let me give one example, and then I'll turn it over to Steph or someone else, which is the lessons of Athens versus Sparta and the Peloponnesian War. If I had a nickel for every time I heard, well, history teaches us that the rise of power in Athens, blah, 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 Spartan, therefore, China's rise is a threat. I submit to you, Rudy, I submit to you, why would we think that a primitive battle between 2 Greek states from 2,500 years ago tells us anything about China today? It might, but I think that question needs to be asked and not simply asserted. Same thing for like World War I, right? Again, the lessons of World War I for China. Well, Germany was a rising power. They were nationalistic. And look at what happened. Oh my God, right? I think this needs to be asked much more than simply asserted. And I don't think that we are Orientalists. I don't think we're saying everything is different. If you read the book, if you read my work, it's easy to caricature it as an Orientalist argument that says East is East and West is West. Not doing that. We're saying what's similar, what's different. And it only comes, and I'll say this to all the other students out there, anyone's doing it, it only comes from taking the evidence seriously. This is not something that we're going to do talking off the top of our heads. It needs to be social science. How's your measure? If you don't like the measure that I've done, the only thing that I accept is you got to do a better job than I did, man. That's it. You got to say, you measured it wrong. Here's my better measure of war. Anyway, I'll stop there. Steph.
Yeah, I think I take a little bit more of a methodological tack with respect to this question of ethnocentrism, Rudy. I mean, I'm not exactly arguing that European theories are ethnocentric. What I'm arguing is that certain claims about the effect of systemic structure on conflict can't be tested without comparing systems. And when you talk about, the type of systems we're talking about in which polarity is a factor, we just haven't had many cases of hegemonies, despite the loose use of the term, because the American hegemony is really nested within a bipolar, great power structure. And then you've got multipolarity dominating the European scene for most of its history. And so to me, the value in part of looking at Asia is not for any anthropological reason, which is, I think, where you are heading. You were beginning to talk about, can we think of an anthropology which is significantly abstract that we could have a general theory, which I think is, I disagree with because I'm more of a culturalist than that. But I think that on some of these key questions in IR theory, it's really about the advantage of looking at China as a test case of a different system. It's not about ethnocentrism. It's about expanding the palette so that you can make comparative choices which give you, ultimately something like causal leverage, to the extent that we believe in that.
Any other question? I actually have a question. All right.
Youngmi, I just want you to make sure, I want to answer your question, but there are questions also in the chat, just for you.
Yeah, there's a bunch of people who said in the chat.
Yeah. Eliza, yeah. Go ahead first.
Thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today. I'm reading your book and it's really, really interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure other people have some. So I'm just going to ask you two. In the chapter 2, you're talking about 4 eras of China evolution in East Asia. And you kind of stop in the 19th-20th century. So I was wondering, how would you call today's era? And how would you describe it? Are we still in part 4 in the imperialism, or would you put a new name on it? Would you describe it in a different way? And my second question would be, you talk about the constant of Chinese unipolarity through history. So even if you have periods, it stops, it will often come back. So would you say this is the case today, or would you say it's coming in the near future? And what would be the elements that would bring back Chinese hegemony in East Asia? Thank you.
Steph, go ahead, Steph.
No, I'm going to let you take that one. You're that.
I tried to palm that one off on you. Well, okay, what we did, first of all, writing that chapter was really, because we're trying to squish 2000, just trying to make some general statements about what the region looked like, right? And we stopped in the 20th century. My punting on that will be, that's volume 2. But, realistically, I mean, one of the interesting things now, of course, is, and one of the reasons that I don't, even though I'm often misquoted as saying I think China will recreate its tributary system, I explicitly say it won't. The world is different now. Nobody thinks that way. I mean, China may use elements of it, but everybody from China has a passport, man. They are the biggest defenders of the Westphalian sovereign nation state, right? It's my territory. Don't tell me what to do in my territory. So there's really it is this fascinating thing where all these East Asian countries are partially Westernized, but we know they're not totally Westernized. And the question is, how deep does that go in terms of a system or whatever else, right? Are they, there's a core set of participants, and I'll give you one example that I've sort of come to when I think about this is like, we have all this research in IR about the democratic peace. It's this, it's institutional, it's blah, blah, blah. And it might simply be a cultural grouping of a bunch of countries that are similar. They're the core participants. And then there's a bunch of authoritarian countries that still participate in Westphalia, but they're marginal, they're the periphery, and they don't really buy everything, right? They'll sort of grudgingly go along with some of the rules and norms, but they don't really buy it, and so that's sort of the way we're beginning to think about it. I don't know if that helps. But
yeah, Lisa, let's go offline on this at some point and continue this debate, because I don't want to venture too deeply into it. But let me just tell you what I think the contours of the debate on China, how they're emerging right now. Because for a long period of time, I think they were primarily between realists and liberals. Just again to stylize, basically Mearsheimer versus Eichenberry, just to drop names. But now I think what's happening is they're pessimistic and optimistic liberals. And the liberals believe that the institutional framework and core ideational elements are going to manage to hold the system together. And, I mean, Eichenberry to a certain extent still holds this view, even though he's become more, cautious. But I have a little piece called Liberal Pessimism, which was published in an Australian journal, which is a phrase I want to coin. And what it does is it basically says, look, all of the components of the liberal piece are actually under deep challenge at the moment. And so there's a version of the current world order that is rooted in liberalism, yet pessimistic. And it's pessimistic because you have now two authoritarian great powers. You have extensive backsliding, which calls into question the democratic peace prescriptions. You have international institutions which are illiberal, which calls into question whether cooperation is something which is a blunt to conflict, because now you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And this is a big research project I'm doing now. There are dozens of organizations that are authoritarian international institutions. And you're telling me cooperation is good? And then finally, you have statist political economies. I mean, the phase two of the so-called phase two of the Trump trade deal was not designed as phase two. It was just simply all the issues that Trump couldn't resolve with the Chinese. What are the issues he couldn't resolve? They basically center on industrial policy and fundamental differences in system. And the debate is, can a system like China get absorbed into the current, rule-ordered system? And there's some of us who think, no, it can't. It's really impossible. And then you're starting to talk about a world in which you get decoupling, not just as a conscious policy, but because there's an adequate perception of risk that you get drift. And I think my view is that we really are at a kind of epochal moment where we could be seeing something like system change, where there's a recognition that the multilateral institutions can't serve as a framework, and that you're going to get a club of democracies or something else, and then you're going to have other worlds, which are living in some different, normative and universe. So I mean, you can see that there's a lot there, and I don't want to get us sidetracked on that, but I think the debate is being reformulated, and if you see these very important pieces by people like Kirk Campbell, who basically said, look, engagement, we got it wrong. These are extraordinarily influential pieces in the United States right now. And they're saying, look, we were wrong. We were wrong.
Sorry, I missed the chatting box. Actually, John, are you there? John will have a question, and then Jay, and then Yue. Okay?
Yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting talk, and big admirer of both your work. So this was really, really fascinating. I want to go back to a point Sangpyeong made earlier regarding long histories of war making and violence in the Inter-Asian, Central Asian region in Asia. David Robinson just came out with a really, really fascinating book, In the Shadow of the Mongol Empire. And in there, he makes a really interesting argument that in many ways, this sort of kind of Sinocentric peaceful order that the Ming tried to, in a sense, promulgate was a byproduct of the fact that the Ming was constantly at war with the remnants of the Yuan, and basically had lost a lot of the old kind of Chinggisic contacts that had maintained peace in the Inter-Asian region in the 13th and 14th century. So this is I think basically the so-called peaceful order is a byproduct of the Ming need to protect its flank against really an extremely violent, volatile situation in the northern and western parts of what we call China, which doesn't really end either, one could argue. You have Hamill Crossley's chapter in your volume. This is really a long history of violence in many parts of what we call the Sinocentric world. So my question basically is that shouldn't we be taking more of a regional systems approach to peace in East Asia? It's in some ways really a byproduct of violence in other parts of Asia.
In case you did not
Okay,
meet John, John is a lecturer from University of Durham.
Great, nice to meet you. I think I've read some of your stuff. I was trying to think. Unfortunately, John Lee is a relatively common name, but I'm sure I've read some of your stuff. So it's nice to meet you. That's precisely what we do, right? I mean, that's the thing. I would encourage you. I mean, again, I don't want us to get too focused on something which we really weren't. You know, this wasn't the purpose of the volume, right? I've done a lot of stuff on this. My first book on East Asia Before the West. I will put some links. I think it's on my website, davecong.net, to stuff where I've gone very carefully, precisely here. And here's the problem. Here's the problem with the way everybody thinks about this. In fact, this is what I criticized Dinkeko and Wang and Ko and what's his name? Arbin Wang over at UCLA. Everybody argues Chinese threats were unidirectional from the nomads. They were, absolutely. They fought with them all the time. But you know what they don't do? They don't ask why. Why? Why were threats from Central Asian societies as opposed to from enormously powerful settled societies on its east and southern flanks, when we know that they could fight, and they did fight once in a while? That's the question. Why couldn't they? The short answer that I give, and the precise argument I make in the book and that I keep coming back to, is the nomads hated everything about Chinese society. They really disagreed. I don't think it's geographic or structural. I think it was cultural. They were determined to remain who they were, and the Chinese were determined to remain who they were. It was much harder to make agreements and figure stuff out between them than it was between societies that looked very similar. I don't think this is that surprising. We do that today. We call it the democratic peace. That's my point, right? I'm not that surprised. But you can't simply say, this is not sort of a convincing argument to me. Well, they fought horrific wars occasionally, but they didn't all the time. So therefore, we're going to ignore all the times they didn't fight, i.e. Japan's invasion, or, 668 AD or 663 AD, when Yamato Japan was deeply involved in the first East Asian War that Nadia writes about. They were clearly parts of the system. But the rates of conflict were clearly different between Central Asia and East Asia. That's the question.
We have a question from Professor J. Lewis from Oxford.
Oh, hello, David and Stephan. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for producing this book. Basically, many of the questions I wanted to raise have already been raised and even answered, but I would like to make a comment and maybe ask one final little question. In defense of the book, perhaps against the questions raised by Samjin and my colleague John Lee, I mean, basically, the book is really high medieval period. It's not a pluralistic world that is being examined, aside from a kind of an odd chapter on the 7th century. It's for the most part looking at the period of East Asia from about 1400 onwards. So you have to forgive them that they're ignoring Goryeo, and they're ignoring a variety of other periods outlined quite well, quite long ago by Maurice Rossby, and the pluralistic structure around the Song dynasty. But the minor little question I have was something that Stephan just said about decoupling, because I wanted to really ask if this book was conceived to kind of rebut Graham Ellison's Thucydides trap. And so you've already touched upon that. But Stephen mentioned decoupling, and I really don't, in a way, I agree with you. I'm kind of a pessimistic liberal. I really don't think that the Chinese order is going to be absorbed into our grand, whatever it is. But rather, I think it might be the other way around, considering the size of China. And if you look historically over the longue durée, you'll see that basically it has always been able to absorb things that come at it. Particularly economically, if not even politically. And so I rather see that the question is the other way around. How far will we be absorbed by this system? And that, I mean, that's the provocative question. You don't have to address it. I just thought I'd reveal myself. Thank you.
Steph?
Yeah, it's so gratifying to hear that we didn't completely misfire in this venture from someone of your stature, I have to say. But let me just pose one observation and tell you how this is being thought about, at least among the RIR crowd. And this is a term that we love to hate, but we don't have an alternative to it. But it basically, the debate is centering around the concept of hedging. And I say we love to hate it because no one has a very precise definition of what it means. But the structural features of the system that give rise to it are what lead me to believe that your prediction is probably will not pan out as you've suggested. And that is that the countries on China's peripheries are concerned about China. And they have a partial option, and they're exploiting it. So if you put those things together, it suggests that as the Koreans and the Thais and the Pakistanis and everyone says, we don't, and ASEAN more generally, we do not want to get caught up in this fight. But what that means is that they're making sure that they are engaging in strategies of enmeshment where they're not relying solely on China. And I can tell you from the Korean case, which I know somewhat better, that there are debates going on right now in the Blue House, literally about what share of trade, of Korean trade with China is optimal and what's too high. And policies like the Moon Southern policy and Northern policy are about this thing you just hear relentlessly is the necessity of diversification and doubts about the BRI risk. So I don't rule out the possibility, Jay, that you're right, that this will, in fact, we really will decline to such a state that we won't be seen as a meaningful option. But I do think the countries on the periphery are looking for something like a balancing option.
Thank you.
I think Dave disagrees with that.
I keep missing questions from chatting box. I think Yue from Nanjing, right, in China, has a question, and then Holly and Shihui in order. Yue, do you want to ask a question directly? He's our PhD student, but based in Nanjing.
Sorry,
yes.
yeah, I just got the video fixed. And anyway, and thank you for the professors for the interesting talk. And I have a question regarding to the way of Asian regionalism. Since there is a shared history in East Asia with a history of conflicts as well, is it possible for East Asia to generate its way of regionalism as the EU did before? Although there's a regional interaction, such as a recently signed agreement of the RCEP, East Asian states are still remain deeply distrust of each other, especially between the three regional economic powers, China, Japan, and South Korea. How would you suggest the way for East Asian states to overcome distrust between states and also to diffuse their threat perception from the history of conflict?
I think Dave and I both have views of this. Dave, do you want to take this one, or you want me to jump in? I'm getting the contemporary questions. So I think, I guess what I would say is the consensus is that these architectures can coexist and overlap, and that creates problems, but they're not insurmountable, and basically firms figure out how to adjust to them. So you'll have a BRI, you'll have an RCEP, you'll have a CPTPP, and you'll have all the FTAs that the United States has signed in the region and that the region has signed with the rest of the world simultaneously. And that the chances that these will actually drive one another out in a Darwinian fashion so that one formula kind of triumphs, I think that teleological Whig view of history is kind of over. I mean, there was a view at one point that the natural end state was a free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific. And people like Fred Bergsten said, the natural thing to do is you've got the Americas and you've got East and Southeast Asia, and there should just be one free trade area, and APEC or something like that should be the format in which that would occur. No one believes that anymore, because each grouping is going to strike arrangements which are tolerable to that group and nothing more. And it's very interesting that in the RCEP, India ultimately dropped out. Why did it drop out? It couldn't even meet those standards. So I think you're just, we're going to be living with this, and this gets to Jay's question as well. We're just going to be living with this architecture in which you've got these coexisting formats, and then you've got firms figuring out down at the individual firm strategic level, well, how do I navigate between an RCEP rule and a CPTPP rule and a BRIE rule?
We have a question from Holly and Shihui later.
I'll try to keep this very quick. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I want to get back to, I guess, the theme that Rudiger's second comment was touching upon, and also came up in Stephan's answer to that comment, which is, I guess, thinking about the big picture and the value and the contribution of this project, because it's incredibly interesting to get historians and IR specialists together thinking about these big questions. And absolutely, it makes sense to look at another model, right? That's not drawing from the European example. But I guess I just wonder, how do you see the value from that and the contribution? For example, in the quote that Stephan read from Se-Young Park's contribution, talking about how law, can be used in, rather problematic ways that don't live up to some of the ideas that, they fit within some of the classic theoretical ways that people have looked at law. Do you think that this is applicable solely to East Asia, or maybe some of the European examples may also be based on some problematic assumptions about what law does in different societies? So I guess, do you see your contribution as solely thinking about Asia, or do you see any overlap and interplay going back to, the study of international relations in Europe and elsewhere as well?
Holly, this is an incredibly good question, and I'm going to give you what sounds like a weak answer to it, but I think it's actually a strong answer to it. And that is that we wanted this book to generate conversations. And what I mean by that is we purposefully eschewed the idea of laying down a theoretical structure and asking these historians to plug their stuff into some arcane other disciplinary language, which may or may not have made any sense to them. And so what we tried to encourage the authors to do was to take an event that they were interested in, and the event language, fortunately, unfortunately, I think is partly my fault, to tell us what that event was, to offer a causal explanation of why it occurred, and then to turn the arrows around and ask what the consequences were, and to allow the theoretical debate to emerge out of the historical literature in which they themselves were engaged, with nudges from us, But the purpose was never to reach for generalizations. And by the way, one of my other hats, I'm interested in qualitative methods and teach a course on qualitative methods. But the purpose was never a generalizing one in a strong sense, to submit each of these to some, kind of rule. But it was to try to, use these cases to generate different ways of thinking about problems around which we've become too comfortable. So, in rereading those chapters, for example, I was really struck by these points about law. Now, am I making a general statement about law? No, but I'm saying, maybe we should be thinking about this in a little bit different way after looking at what legal pluralism means and what extraterritoriality was and what do we mean by equal or unequal treaties. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer or not, but I really think that that's what we were trying to do.
That's great, thank you.
I think I missed the last question from Shi Hui. Shi Hui, are you there?
Yes.
Young-Mi, you get a question too.
I know, yeah. Shi Hui is our PhD student.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So I have a question is that you mentioned before about the role of rules and norms. And it is true that those treaties between China and the Western countries and China and Japan during the Opium War was unequal. But China still signed to it. And China's also integrated into the liberal international order since the 1970s. And it is now still part of it and wanted to claim to be a more responsible stakeholder in the international order, as it wants to propose a new kind of globalization based on win-win. So there's a lot of evidence to show that the liberal international order is not really truly based on democratic values. It sorts a lot of wars in the Middle East. And it seems like the rules, norms is a kind of guise of the scientific methods, to theorize this kind of democratic peace theory. It is more kind of imperialistic. So how far do you think that it is actually that China's subordination into the international system is because China has no epistemological right? It's simply China has no right to knowledge. And then if China and Chinese scholars want to introduce the Chinese characteristics into the IR theory, what challenges are there? Thank you.
Dave, you want to take this? This is such a good question. We should probably both offer at least brief answers.
Why don't
go
you
ahead,
start?
Dave. No, go ahead, Dave.
Let me just very, very, very briefly, right? I mean, I think these are fabulous questions. And I think they get to they force us, and in some ways this goes to Holly's question, right? They're putting a lens on the contemporary issue that are sort of in some ways troubling us, right? In a good way, causing us to rethink how deep is actually this Westphalian system and what does it actually mean? Do we just, because we sort of just take it for granted, everybody's the same, nation states. But I think your question points out, and I think some of the research aims us at, maybe there's some influences back on us. Maybe there's some lessons to be learned back on contemporary world that we can take from these chapters that cause us to rethink things.
Look, this is my favorite question of the day. I'm rereading Niebuhr, and one of the things that Niebuhr points out is that everyone's a hypocrite. And great powers in particular are hypocrites because they like to portray their way of structuring the world as having, normative truth and being absolutely right. And so we've just gone through a period of tremendous hubris on the part of the United States, and we've had earlier periods of hubris. But that said, I think that this is a debate which China needs to have with itself, frankly, because there is a question. The US has undergone periods during which it has subjected itself to international law. Never fully, always with hypocrisy, always with exceptions, but has nonetheless been, subjected itself to international law. And the question, I think, for China now is, to what extent is it willing to do that? And that's a fight within China right now that isn't resolved. And there's a question more deeply about whether an authoritarian regime can submit itself to international law, because a central feature of authoritarianism is that it rejects the rule of law, because the party can always overturn the law. And so, I think, just to talk, for example, about the economic issues, you know, the WTO hasn't been updated since the time that China entered. So for China to say that it's in abidance with its commitments when it's pioneered practices which are outside of that multilateral framework strikes me as a little disingenuous. And I think that's where the debate is happening. You know, can we incorporate Chinese practice under international law, or are we going to have to think of a world in which, look, you know, China is just going to have to operate to some extent separately because we can't absorb them. And, you know, look, we've come out of 4 crazy years in the United States, where for us to talk about standing up for international law is pretty difficult to do, right? Exactly. But we have done it in the past. And I think that there is a consensus we should do it again.
I find this webinar is fascinating. I didn't know time went this fast. I have a final speculative, it could be a question or comment. A few years ago, when I went to this international conference, I think it was ISA or AAS, I don't remember, roundtable with Professor Peter Katzenstein and Professor Amitabh Acharya, and they were talking about global order. And, you know, Peter actually mentioned that in his lifetime, he believes US hegemony will be there. But then again, we see with the Trump administration and then now Biden, US is more interested in taking care of domestic matters. From this year, China reached the largest economy in the world now. But then again, this, you know, emerging power, potential hegemon can be speculative, because there used to be Japan will be the next power. It could be Germany or Brazil. It didn't actually reach the emerging or the status of hegemon, right? So if we follow this speculative next hegemony or hegemon, if we follow the trend of China, if that could be China, then what would be the signal, the moment we may think it will be China? It will be the next hegemon will be China after US.
Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, I'll go first. Just a couple concluding things for everything. I'll try to be short. First of all, thank you, Professor Kim, for inviting me. Thank all of you who are mostly based in Europe. This is awesome. Even though we're all on the web, I realize, I think most of you are European. It's nice to meet you and start a conversation. I'd really love to hear more and interact with all of you. A final point about the whole war thing is we got off. The book is not about wars. That is a separate issue that I've been writing about myself. There's a lot of scholarship on it. We just can't talk off the top of our heads about it in any systematic manner. So I didn't want to be, I hope I didn't come across as dismissive, but it's like, we're not going to talk about it in 5 minutes. There's a whole literature on this stuff, which I encourage you to engage in, right? So, you know, I just want to keep the book clear. It's not about, oh, there's less war. Okay, we're not Orientalists. On this, I will say one thing. If there is a lesson that comes out of East Asian history, it's that moral authority is more important for hegemony than military power or material power. And when I look at China right now, even though I'm more sanguine about the future of the order, one thing that's very clear is China has no moral authority. Nobody looks to China as the source of civilization around the world. Nobody does that. Nobody looks to China for a source of ideas and innovation about how to organize their societies and families and rectify the names and blah, blah, blah. That is absolutely what happened in the past. But it's not there today. And so if you ask me, until that happens, China might be big, but it's not going to be a hegemon. They need to have some kind of authority, not just power.
Yeah, and that's authority used in the kind of David Lake sense of the ability to command followers. Look, I'll just make one very brief point on this, because I think it's something about the post-war order that's really been misunderstood, and that is that it isn't just the United States. And in particular, in East Asia, the United States has always pursued an offshore balancing strategy, which is why you have this concept of the free and independent, Asia, the free and open Indo-Pacific, just following naturally. Biden's not going to touch that. He's going to stay exactly with a concept which was introduced ultimately by Abe, but then through Abe was picked up by Trump. And so I think the question is not so much China versus the United States, it's more actually Europe, Japan, and the other East Asian countries, plus the United States, and what those relationships look like. And, I don't follow the debate about China policy in Europe anywhere near as closely as I would like. But from an American standpoint, the shift over the last year has just been dramatic. A very much different set of concerns, a more nervous Europe about the implications of China than I've seen in a decade. And I think that's probably going to be as important as what happens in the United States or in China alone.
Thank you, Professor Haggard and Professor Kang and the rest of our audience. I just asked Sang-Pil how many countries participate in this webinar. And he said originally 13 different countries, and the actual countries attended today is actually 8 different countries. That's why I had to say good morning to good afternoon to good evening. And I hope, after this pandemic, Edinburgh University, will be very active. So I hope to see you all in Edinburgh in the future at our future international conference or workshop. Thank you all. Anything else, right?
Well, just thanks to all of you for coming on. It's not just Yomi, of course, we owe tremendous debt, but the rest of you were willing to sit and listen to us for an hour and a half is itself quite remarkable. So thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you to you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
I think you can end now.
Okay. Thank you.
So long, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.